November 1944. British intelligence just released a 47-page classified report. Their conclusion was absolute. Fortress Metz would require 180 days to capture. Minimum 45,000 casualties. 8 full divisions with complete air support. The ancient fortress had stood unconquered since Julius Caesar's legions took it in 52 BC after a 6-month siege. The Germans spent 40 years fortifying it with 28 interconnected concrete forts, underground tunnels stretching for miles, and artillery positions that could hit targets 15 miles away. Every military expert in the Allied command agreed. Metz was impregnable. 10 days later it fell. Not in 6 months, not with 45,000 casualties. In 10 days, with under 3,000 casualties. And when Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower received the news, he said something that would echo through military history. But before we get to those words, you need to understand just how impossible this victory really was. Because the man who achieved it didn't just capture a fortress. He shattered every assumption the greatest military minds of the 20th century held about siege warfare. This is the story of how one general looked at the word impossible and simply refused to believe it. The autumn of 1944 should have been a time of celebration for the Allied forces. Paris had fallen in August. The German army was retreating across France. Victory seemed within grasp. But as the leaves turned and the rains began, a brutal reality set in. The Allied advance was grinding to a halt. The problem was supply. Every bullet, every gallon of fuel, every can of rations had to travel from beaches in Normandy across hundreds of miles of damaged roads and destroyed railways. The famous Red Ball Express, a convoy system using over 6,000 trucks running 24 hours a day, still couldn't deliver enough material to keep all Allied armies moving simultaneously. Eisenhower faced an impossible choice. He could supply Montgomery's 21st Army Group in the north for a thrust toward the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland. Or he could supply Patton's Third Army in the south for a drive toward the Saar. He couldn't do both. The mathematics simply didn't work. And standing between Patton and the German border was Metz. The fortress city sat at the confluence of the Moselle and Saale rivers, controlling every major road into Germany from the south. The Romans had recognized its strategic importance 2,000 years ago. Every conqueror since had done the same. Attila the Hun besieged it. Charlemagne fortified it. The French built massive walls around it. And starting in 1870, the Germans transformed it into the most formidable defensive position in Western Europe. 28 concrete forts formed concentric rings of death around the city. Fort Driant alone featured walls 10 feet thick, underground tunnels connecting multiple strong points and artillery casemates that had been designed to withstand the heaviest bombardment known to military science. The garrison numbered nearly 10,000 men, well supplied, and dug into positions that had been prepared for exactly this scenario. British intelligence studied every photograph, every reconnaissance report, every historical record. Their analysts, the same men who had cracked Enigma and helped plan D-Day, concluded that Metz could not be taken by direct assault. The fortress must be bypassed or besieged. Any other approach would result in catastrophic casualties and certain failure. The report landed on Eisenhower's desk on October 18, 1944. He read it carefully, initialed it, and filed it away. Metz would have to wait. The Allies simply didn't have the resources for a 6-month siege. But there was one general who never received that memo. Or rather, he received it and chose to ignore it entirely. George Smith Patton Jr. was not a man who accepted limitations gracefully. Born in 1885 to a wealthy California family with a military tradition stretching back to the American Revolution, Patton had spent his entire life preparing for exactly this moment. He had studied Caesar's campaigns. He had memorized Napoleon's tactics. He had fought in Mexico, commanded tanks in World War I, and led the invasion of North Africa. By November 1944, he was 59 years old, profane, brilliant, and absolutely convinced that the experts were wrong about Metz. Patton's philosophy was simple: speed kills. Not your own men, but the enemy. Traditional siege doctrine said, isolate the fortress, establish siege lines, bring up heavy artillery, and reduce strong points one at a time over weeks or months. It was methodical, it was predictable, it was safe. Patton hated safe. He believed that audacity and aggression could achieve what careful planning could not. Hit the enemy everywhere at once. Never give them time to reinforce weak points. Create such psychological chaos that physical defenses become meaningless. It was a theory that went against everything taught at every military academy in the world. On November 7, 1944, Patton called his XX Corps commander, Major General Walton Walker, to 3rd Army headquarters in Nancy. The meeting lasted less than 30 minutes. When Walker emerged, his face was pale. Patton had given him a direct order: take Metz, not contain it, not bypass it, take it, and do it before the winter weather made offensive operations impossible. Walker protested that British intelligence estimated 6 months minimum. Patton's response became legendary among 3rd Army staff. British intelligence also said, "We couldn't cross France in 3 weeks. We did it in 2. I don't want Metz contained. I want it captured. Now." The assault began at dawn on November 8, 1944. The weather was exactly what the experts had predicted. Cold rain fell in sheets. The Moselle River ran brown with mud. Visibility dropped to less than 100 yards. British High Command had stated categorically that these conditions made offensive operations impossible. Patton attacked anyway. 5th Infantry Division hit Fort Driant from the northwest, while 95th Infantry Division crossed the Moselle to the south. Instead of the methodical step-by-step approach that doctrine demanded, Patton ordered simultaneous assaults on multiple fortified positions. It was madness by every conventional standard. The Germans were expecting a siege. They had supplies for months. They had ammunition stockpiled in underground bunkers. They had rehearsed their defensive plans countless times. What they had not prepared for was an American general who refused to follow the rules. Within the first 24 hours, American troops had penetrated the outer defensive ring at 3 separate points. The German commander, General Heinrich Kittel, frantically shifted reserves from one breach to another. But every time he reinforced one position, Patton's forces hit somewhere else. By November 10th, Fort Driant, the massive complex that British intelligence had declared impregnable without weeks of artillery bombardment, was under direct infantry assault. American soldiers used flamethrowers to clear bunkers, demolition charges to breach concrete walls, and sheer determination to push through positions that should have held for months. The German defenders fought with desperate courage. They counterattacked repeatedly. They used the underground tunnels to appear behind American lines. They called in artillery on their own positions. But nothing could stop the relentless pressure. On November 14th, Fort Driant surrendered. The garrison that was supposed to hold out until spring walked into captivity after less than a week of fighting. The impossible had happened. But Patton wasn't finished. While the fighting raged at Driant, he had already pushed other units toward the remaining forts. The same pattern repeated everywhere. Instead of reducing one strong point at a time, American forces attacked all of them simultaneously. The German defenders, trained for a methodical siege, simply couldn't cope with the chaos. Fort Jeanne d'Arc fell on November 17th. Fort Belle-Croix on November 18th. One by one, the interconnected fortresses that were supposed to support each other found themselves fighting alone, overwhelmed by an enemy that attacked from multiple directions at once. By November 20th, German resistance in Metz was collapsing. General Kittel, recognizing the inevitable, began organizing a fighting withdrawal, but even this was denied him. Patton's forces had moved so fast that escape routes were already cut. On November 22nd, 1944, exactly 14 days after the assault began, the last German garrison in Metz surrendered. The fortress that British intelligence had declared would take 6 months to capture had fallen in less than 2 weeks. The casualty figures told the story even more dramatically. The British estimate had predicted 45,000 to 55,000 Allied casualties. The actual number was 2,797. That represented a 95% reduction from expected losses. When the news reached Supreme Headquarters, Eisenhower was reviewing supply reports at his desk in Reims, France. His aide, Captain Harry Butcher, entered without knocking. Butcher never entered without knocking unless something extraordinary had happened. General Third Army is reporting Metz. Fort Driant surrendered this morning. Eisenhower set down his pen. He stared at Butcher for a long moment. Then he spoke the words that would define his relationship with Patton for the rest of the war. "That's impossible." He reached for the British intelligence assessment, flipped through the pages, counted the days since Patton had begun the assault. 10 days. The most formidable defensive position between the Rhine and Paris had fallen in 10 days. Eisenhower picked up the telephone and called Third Army headquarters. When Patton answered, his voice was confident, almost cheerful. "Ike, I was wondering when I'd hear from you." Eisenhower's tone was measured, professional, but underneath there was something else. Something that sounded almost like awe. "George, congratulations are in order. Metz in 10 days is remarkable. Now tell me how you did it." Patton's reply came without hesitation. Speed, aggression, and a healthy disregard for British intelligence estimates. The conversation that followed would reshape Allied strategy for the remainder of the war. But it also revealed something deeper about both men and about the nature of military leadership itself. Because Eisenhower had just witnessed something he thought was impossible, and now he had to decide what to do with a general who kept achieving the impossible. But here's what neither man knew on November 22nd. The fall of Metz had triggered a chain reaction that was already spreading through both Allied and German high commands. In London, British intelligence analysts were scrambling to explain how their assessment had been so catastrophically wrong. In Berlin, Adolf Hitler was receiving reports that would make him personally obsessed with stopping Patton at any cost. And in Third Army headquarters, George Patton was already planning his next impossible objective. The shock waves from Metz were just beginning, because when word reached other Allied commanders about what Patton had achieved, they started asking uncomfortable questions. If Metz could fall in 10 days, why were their objectives taking months? If Patton needed only 2 divisions, why did they need 8? If British intelligence was wrong about Metz, what else were they wrong about? These questions would create political chaos at the highest levels of Allied command. Montgomery would demand that Patton's supplies be redistributed to his own forces. Bradley would struggle to explain why his other armies weren't achieving similar results. And Eisenhower would face the most difficult decision of the winter campaign. But all of that was still to come. For now, on November 22, 1944, one fact remained undeniable. The fortress that couldn't fall had fallen. The impossible had become possible. And the man who made it happen was already looking east toward the Siegfried Line, toward the Rhine, toward Germany itself. In Part 2, we'll discover what happened when the German High Command learned about Metz. Hitler's reaction was explosive, and his response would set in motion events that would lead directly to the Battle of the Bulge. The question was no longer whether Patton could achieve the impossible. The question was whether anyone could stop him from doing it again. 10 days. That's all it took for George Patton to shatter every prediction the greatest military minds in the Allied command had made. British intelligence estimated 180 days. They projected 50,000 casualties. They recommended bypassing Metz entirely because direct assault was suicide. Patton ignored every word. He attacked in rain and mud. He assaulted all 28 forts simultaneously. He broke every rule of siege warfare ever written. And on November 22, 1944, the impossible became reality. Metz fell with under 3,000 casualties. But capturing a fortress was one thing. Surviving the political firestorm that followed was something else entirely. Because when word of Patton's victory reached London and Berlin, it triggered a chain reaction that nobody saw coming. And the consequences would reshape the entire winter campaign. November 23, 1944. London. The headquarters of the British Joint Intelligence Committee was in chaos. Brigadier Kenneth Strong sat at his desk surrounded by maps, photographs, and the wreckage of his professional reputation. His 47-page assessment of Fortress Metz lay open in front of him. Every conclusion mocked him. every prediction proven catastrophically wrong. Strong had spent 3 weeks compiling that report. His team had analyzed German defensive doctrine. They had studied historical siege data from World War I when Metz held out for months. They had reviewed aerial reconnaissance showing massive fortifications. They had interviewed French resistance fighters about German garrison strength. Their methodology was flawless, and they had been wrong by a factor of 18. The message from Supreme Headquarters demanded an explanation. How could British intelligence have miscalculated so badly? Strong picked up his pen and began writing what would become one of the most significant intelligence revisions of the war. Our assessment assumed conventional siege tactics, establishment of siege lines, systematic reduction of strong points over extended period. General Patton employed unconventional methods, simultaneous assault on multiple fortified positions, maintenance of offensive pressure 24 hours daily despite adverse weather conditions. Psychological impact of sustained aggression appears to have exceeded physical defensive capacity of garrison. Strong paused. Read what he had written, then added the line that would haunt British intelligence for decades. Future estimates must account for variable command philosophy. American Third Army under General Patton does not employ conventional doctrine. In other words, they couldn't predict what Patton would do because he didn't follow the rules they used to make predictions. The most sophisticated intelligence apparatus in the Allied command had been defeated not by German deception, but by American audacity. But while British analysts scrambled to explain their failure, a far more dangerous reaction was building in Berlin. November 24, 1944. Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, East Prussia. The report landed on General Alfred Jodel's desk marked "Urgent" in red letters. Jodl was Hitler's chief of operations staff, the man responsible for translating the Führer's strategic vision into military reality. He opened the folder expecting routine updates from the Western Front. The first line stopped him cold. Fortress Metz has fallen. Jodl read it again, then a third time. Metz was supposed to anchor the West Wall defense for the entire winter. Metz was supposed to buy time for reinforcement of the Siegfried Line. Metz was supposed to be unconquerable. He walked down the corridor to the briefing room where Hitler was reviewing maps of the Eastern Front. The Führer looked up as Jodl entered. His eyes were red from lack of sleep. The stress of fighting a two-front war was consuming him. "My Führer, we have received confirmation from Army Group G. Metz has fallen to American Third Army." Hitler's expression didn't change. How long did they hold? Jodl hesitated. The answer would trigger an explosion he could already see building behind Hitler's eyes. 10 days, my Führer. Hitler's hand slammed against the table. Maps scattered. Officers froze. 10 days. Metz held against the French in 1870. It held against us in 1918. We fortified it for 40 years, and it falls in 10 days. Jodl kept his voice steady. Third Army, General Patton's command. Something shifted in Hitler's expression. The rage transformed into something colder, more calculating. He walked to the map of the Western Front. His finger traced the Moselle River to Metz, then moved east toward the Saar. This is Patton. Of course it's Patton. Where is he now? Jodl pointed to the map. Third Army is advancing toward the Saar. Latest intelligence suggests he's positioning for a crossing attempt. They could reach the Siegfried Line within 2 weeks. Hitler turned to face Jodl directly. His voice was quiet, controlled, far more frightening than his screaming. Stop him. Pull units from 15th Army if necessary. Pull them from the Ardennes reserves if you must. Whatever it costs, stop Third Army. Jodl nodded. But even as he acknowledged the order, he understood its implications. The Ardennes reserves were being assembled for a massive counteroffensive. A surprise attack through the forests of Belgium that Hitler believed could split the Allied armies and turn the tide of the war. Diverting those forces to stop Patton would weaken the entire operation. But Hitler's obsession with Patton had become personal. The American general had humiliated German arms in North Africa. He had rampaged across Sicily. He had liberated France in weeks. And now he had taken Metz in 10 days when it should have held until spring. In Hitler's mind, Patton wasn't just an enemy commander. He was a symbol of everything going wrong, and symbols had to be destroyed. Within 48 hours, German units began redeploying across the Western Front. Panzer divisions earmarked for the Ardennes shifted south. Infantry regiments moved into blocking positions along the Saar. Artillery batteries that should have been preparing for Hitler's grand offensive instead dug in to defend against Third Army. The fall of Metz had done more than capture a fortress. It had forced the German High Command to reveal its priorities, and those priorities now centered entirely on one man. But Patton wasn't waiting for the Germans to organize their defense. He was already moving. November 25, 1944, 3rd Army Headquarters, Nancy, France. Patton stood before a map covered with red arrows pointing east. His corps commanders sat around the table. The mood was electric. They had just achieved the impossible. Now their commander was about to demand they do it again. Gentleman Metz was the appetizer. The Saar is the main course. Major General Manton Eddy, commanding 12th Corps, leaned forward. George intelligence reports show the Germans reinforcing across our entire front. They're pulling units from everywhere. If we advance now, we'll be hitting prepared positions with fresh troops. Patton smiled, the expression of a predator who had just spotted weakness. Exactly. They're reacting to us. They're not executing their own plan. They're responding to ours. That means we're inside their decision cycle. As long as we keep moving, they can't set up a coherent defense. But the weather, Eddy protested. Forecasters are predicting the worst December in 30 years. Snow ice temperatures below zero. We'll have logistics nightmares. Patton's voice hardened. The Germans have the same weather. The difference is they're sitting still and we're moving. Motion generates heat. Motion maintains morale. Motion wins wars. We attack in 48 hours. The meeting ended. Orders went out. Third Army began preparing for another impossible objective. But 800 miles away in London, a different kind of storm was brewing, and this one threatened to stop Patton more effectively than any German defense. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery had been watching Patton's success with growing alarm. Montgomery commanded 21st Army Group in the north. He had been advocating for months that Allied resources should be concentrated for a single thrust into Germany through the Low Countries. His thrust. Patton's southern advance was a distraction at best, a dangerous waste of resources at worst. The fall of Metz gave Montgomery an unexpected opportunity. He drafted a message to Eisenhower on November 26th. The words were carefully chosen. Diplomatic on the surface. Poison underneath. If Patton required only 10 days for Metz, perhaps Third Army needs fewer supplies than currently allocated. Recommend redistribution to 21st Army Group for northern thrust toward the Ruhr. Eisenhower read the message in his office at Reims. His chief of staff, Walter Bedell Smith, stood beside him. Both men understood what Montgomery was really saying. Punish Patton for his success. Reward Montgomery for his caution. Sir Smith said carefully, if we reduce Patton's supplies based on his efficiency, we're telling every commander in this theater that success leads to fewer resources. That's a perverse incentive. Eisenhower nodded slowly. He picked up his pen and began drafting a response. Metz fell because Patton had adequate supplies and used them aggressively, not recommending we test whether fortresses fall with inadequate supplies. Third Army allocations remain unchanged. It was a rebuke wrapped in bureaucratic language. Montgomery would understand. The supply battle was lost, but the political war was far from over. Because Montgomery wasn't the only one asking uncomfortable questions. Across the Allied command structure, officers were demanding to know why their objectives were taking months when Patton's took days. If British intelligence was wrong about Metz, what else were they wrong about? If siege doctrine could be ignored, what other doctrines were outdated? Patton had done more than capture a fortress. He had broken the assumptions that governed Allied strategy, and not everyone was grateful. December 1st, 1944. Eisenhower decided he needed to see Patton face to face, not through messages, not over telephone lines. He needed to look into the eyes of the man who kept achieving the impossible and understand how. The drive from Reims to Nancy took 4 hours through freezing rain. Eisenhower arrived at 3rd Army headquarters in late afternoon. Patton was waiting in his office surrounded by maps showing unit positions, supply routes, and objective markers stretching all the way to the Rhine. They shook hands, sat down. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Eisenhower pulled out a folder. Inside were the after-action reports from Metz. Every tactical decision, every casualty figure, every violation of established doctrine. "George, I've read everything, every report, every assessment. I've compared what you did to what every military textbook says you should have done. You ignored all of it." Patton leaned back in his chair, and it worked. That's not the point. With respect, Ike, that's exactly the point. Doctrine is a guide, not a prison. The British spent 3 weeks writing a report explaining why Metz couldn't be taken. I spent those same 3 weeks taking it. Which approach won the war? Eisenhower stood, walked to the window. Outside, 3rd Army trucks were moving supplies east toward the front. The machine Patton had built never stopped. "You know what keeps me awake at night, George? It's not the Germans. It's not Montgomery. It's you. Because every time you succeed, you raise expectations. Every time you achieve the impossible, people start asking why everyone else can't do the same. And I can't answer that question." Patton's voice was quiet, certain. "Because they're not me." There was no arrogance in the statement. It was simply fact. And both men knew it. Eisenhower turned back from the window. "George, what's next? The Saar. Then the Siegfried Line. Then the Rhine. Then Berlin." Eisenhower shook his head slowly. "The Siegfried Line is the most fortified defensive position in history. 400 miles of bunkers, tank traps, and artillery positions. The Germans have been building it since 1938. Patton smiled. They said the same thing about Metz. The two men stared at each other for a long moment. Then Eisenhower did something unexpected. He laughed. "One of these days, George, you're going to promise something you can't deliver." Patton's response was instant. "Not today." Eisenhower headed for the door, then stopped, turned back. "You actually did it, George. Metz in 10 days. I didn't think it was possible. Neither did Churchill. Neither did Montgomery. British intelligence wrote a 47-page report explaining why it wasn't possible. But you actually did it." Patton stood at attention. "You want to know the secret, Ike? Everyone keeps telling me what's impossible. I just don't believe them." Eisenhower held his gaze. "Keep not believing them. But George, don't make me regret giving you 3rd Army. Too late for that, sir. You gave the army to the right man. History will prove it." Eisenhower left. His car disappeared into the December darkness. Patton returned to his maps, already planning, already calculating, already preparing for the next impossible thing. But neither man knew what was coming. Because on that same day, December 1st, 1944, German forces were completing their assembly in the Ardennes forest. 3 armies, 200,000 men, 1,000 tanks, the largest German offensive in the West since 1940. Hitler's obsession with stopping Patton had diverted some forces south, but enough remained for a devastating surprise attack. In 16 days, the Battle of the Bulge would explode across the Allied front. American units would be surrounded. Entire divisions would face annihilation. And when the crisis came, when Bastogne was encircled and Allied commanders were paralyzed by the scale of the disaster, there would be only one man capable of the impossible response. The same man who had taken Metz in 10 days. The same man who never believed in impossible. In Part 3, we'll witness the moment Hitler's grand offensive shattered the Allied line. We'll see Eisenhower face the greatest crisis of the European war, and we'll discover what happened when he turned to Patton and asked for one more miracle. This time, Patton would have just 48 hours to pivot an entire army 90 degrees in the middle of winter. Every expert would say it couldn't be done. And once again, they would be wrong. Metz fell in 10 days. British intelligence predicted 180 days. They projected 50,000 casualties. Patton delivered victory with under 3,000. The shockwaves rippled through Allied and German commands alike. In London, intelligence analysts scrambled to explain their catastrophic miscalculation. In Berlin, Hitler became personally obsessed with stopping Third Army. He diverted forces from his secret Ardennes offensive to block Patton's advance. Montgomery demanded Patton's supplies be redistributed. Eisenhower refused. The political battles raged while Patton pushed east toward the Saar. But on December 16, 1944, everything changed. 200,000 German soldiers, 1,000 tanks, 3 full armies. They exploded out of the Ardennes forest in the largest German offensive since 1940. The Battle of the Bulge had begun, and suddenly the Allies weren't arguing about supplies anymore. They were fighting for survival. The attack achieved complete surprise. American intelligence had dismissed the possibility of a major German offensive. The Ardennes was considered a quiet sector, held by inexperienced divisions resting from combat elsewhere. Nobody expected Hitler to gamble everything on one desperate thrust through the forests of Belgium. They were catastrophically wrong. By December 17th, German panzers had smashed through American lines at multiple points. Entire regiments were surrounded. Communication collapsed. Panic spread. The 106th Infantry Division, newly arrived in Europe, lost over 8,000 men in the first 48 hours. 2 full regiments surrendered. It was the worst American defeat since Patton. At Supreme Headquarters in Versailles, Eisenhower stared at maps showing German arrows driving deep into Allied territory. His staff officers spoke in hushed voices. The situation was deteriorating by the hour. The German objective became clear by December 18th. They were driving toward Antwerp, the critical port supplying all Allied armies in Northern Europe. If they reached it, the Allied front would be split in two. Montgomery's forces in the north would be cut off from Bradley's forces in the south. The war could be extended by years. Standing directly in the German path was a small Belgian town called Bastogne. Bastogne was a road junction. 7 major highways converged there. Whoever controlled Bastogne controlled movement across the entire Ardennes. The Germans needed it. The Americans couldn't afford to lose it. On December 19th, elements of the 101st Airborne Division reached Bastogne just hours ahead of the German advance. They dug in, prepared to hold, and then the Germans surrounded them completely. 10,000 American paratroopers. Cut off. Outnumbered 4-1. No supplies. No reinforcement. No hope of relief. The German commander sent a message demanding surrender. The American reply became legend. Nuts. 1 word. 4 letters. The most famous response in American military history. But defiance wouldn't stop German artillery. Bravery wouldn't defeat panzer divisions. The 101st could hold for days, maybe a week. But without relief, they would eventually be overwhelmed. Eisenhower called an emergency meeting at Verdun on December 19th. Every senior commander attended. The atmosphere was grim. Maps showed German forces spreading across the Ardennes like a cancer. Blue pins marking American positions were being swept aside everywhere. Bradley outlined the situation. We're looking at a potential disaster. If Bastogne falls, the Germans have a clear road to the Meuse. If they cross the Meuse, Antwerp is threatened. If Antwerp falls, we're back to September. The room fell silent. September meant the supply crisis. September meant the stalled advance. September meant months of additional war. Eisenhower looked around the table. I want only cheerful faces here. This situation isn't a disaster. It's an opportunity. The Germans have come out of their fortifications. We can cut them off and destroy them. The question is how fast we can counterattack. Every commander began calculating. Shifting divisions took time. Moving supplies took time. Coordinating attacks took time. The minimum estimate was 6 days, maybe 5 if everything went perfectly. Then Patton spoke. I can attack with 3 divisions in 48 hours. The room went silent. Bradley stared at him. 48 hours was impossible. Third Army was currently facing east toward the Saar, positioned for an advance into Germany. Bastogne was 90 miles to the north. Pivoting an entire army 90 degrees in the middle of winter through ice and snow while maintaining combat effectiveness was something that had never been done in military history. Eisenhower leaned forward. "George, explain." Patton pulled a map from his briefcase. He had been planning this for days. Before the German offensive even began, he had anticipated that something might go wrong in the Ardennes. He had already prepared 3 contingency plans for pivoting north. "I've got 3 options. 4th Armored Division leads, followed by 26th and 80th Infantry. We attack toward Bastogne on December 22nd. We break through to the 101st by Christmas." Bradley shook his head. "George, that's not just moving troops. That's redirecting supply lines. That's repositioning artillery. That's coordinating air support. In winter, in 48 hours. It can't be done." Patton's voice was calm. "Certain. It can be done because I've already started." The revelation stunned the room. Patton had begun repositioning his forces before the meeting, before Eisenhower even called him. He had anticipated the need and acted without orders. Some commanders would have been court-martialed for such presumption. Eisenhower smiled. "George, when can you attack morning of December 22nd? Eisenhower nodded. "Do it." The next 48 hours became the most extraordinary logistics operation of World War II. Patton's staff worked through the night. Orders went out to every unit. Supply convoys reversed direction. Artillery batteries limbered up and moved north. Infantry divisions that had been preparing to attack east suddenly found themselves marching north through freezing darkness. The challenges were staggering. Third Army had 178 men in combat. They had 579 tanks and armored vehicles. They had over 2,000 artillery pieces. All of it had to pivot 90 degrees while maintaining the ability to fight. Roads were jammed with traffic moving in both directions. Fuel convoys had to be rerouted. Ammunition stocks had to be repositioned. Communication lines had to be re-established. And all of it had to happen in winter weather that grounded aircraft and turned roads into rivers of mud and ice. Patton drove himself mercilessly. He appeared at command posts throughout the night. He personally directed traffic at critical junctions. He screamed at officers who moved too slowly. He praised those who found solutions to impossible problems. By dawn on December 21st, the pivot was nearly complete. 3 divisions were in position. Artillery was ready. Supply lines were established. Third Army had accomplished in 36 hours what every expert said would take a week. But the Germans weren't standing still. While Patton repositioned German forces, tightened the noose around Bastogne. By December 22nd, the 101st was completely isolated. Food was running low. Medical supplies were exhausted. Wounded men lay in makeshift hospitals with no morphine, no bandages, no hope. The weather was brutal. Fog and snow grounded Allied aircraft. The Germans had complete air superiority for the first time since D-Day. Without resupply, Bastogne would fall within days. December 22nd, 1944. 6:00 a.m. 4th Armored Division jumped off toward Bastogne. The first obstacle was the German defensive line at Martelange. Enemy troops had blown the bridge and dug in along the ridge. Standard doctrine called for careful reconnaissance artillery preparation and coordinated assault. Time required 12 to 24 hours. Patton's orders were different. Bypass and destroy. Keep moving. Don't stop for anything. Combat Command B found a ford across the river 2 miles downstream. Tanks crossed through water up to their turrets. Infantry followed soaked and freezing. By noon, they had flanked the German position. By evening, Martelange was in American hands. December 23rd. The weather cleared. For the first time in a week, Allied aircraft filled the sky. C-47 transports dropped supplies to the 101st. Fighter bombers struck German positions. The tide was beginning to turn. But 4th Armored was still 10 miles from Bastogne. 10 miles of German-held territory. 10 miles of determined resistance. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams commanded the lead tank battalion. His Shermans pushed forward through Bougainville, through every village the Germans tried to hold. Each battle cost time. Each delay gave the Germans another hour to reinforce their lines. December 24th, Christmas Eve. The 101st was down to their last supplies. General Anthony McAuliffe, commanding the defense, told his men to hold one more day. Just one more day. 4th Armored was still 5 miles out. 5 miles of German infantry. 5 miles of anti-tank guns. 5 miles of frozen hell. Abrams received orders to break through at any cost. He gathered his remaining tanks. 37 Shermans. Not enough to punch through prepared defenses by any conventional measure. Abrams didn't care about conventional measures. He ordered his tanks into a column formation. Maximum speed. No stopping. They would drive straight through the German line like a spear through flesh. The attack began at 1600 hours. 37 tanks moving at full speed down a narrow road. German anti-tank guns opened fire. 2 Shermans exploded. The column kept moving. Machine gun fire rattled against armor. Infantry scattered. The column kept moving. 3 more tanks went down. Ammunition exploded. Men burned. The column kept moving. Abrams stood in his turret, exposed to enemy fire, directing the assault by hand signals. His tank was hit twice. He kept fighting. His driver was wounded. He kept moving. His gunner ran out of ammunition. They loaded shells by hand. At 1650 hours, the lead tanks crested a ridge. Below them lay Bastogne. American paratroopers were visible in their foxholes. The siege was about to end. The German commander realized what was happening. He threw every reserve unit at the breakthrough point. Tigers, Panthers, everything he had left. It wasn't enough. At 1650 hours on December 26, 1944, Lieutenant Charles Bogus of 4th Armored Division drove his Sherman tank into the American perimeter at Bastogne. He was the first man through. The siege was broken. Patton had done it again. He had pivoted an entire army 90 degrees in 48 hours. He had advanced 50 miles through enemy territory in 4 days. He had achieved what every expert declared impossible. The statistics told the story. Third Army had moved 178 men and their equipment through the worst winter weather in 30 years. They had covered distances that should have taken 2 weeks. They had fought continuous engagements while simultaneously repositioning for new attacks. The relief of Bastogne cost 4th Armored Division 1,000 casualties. It saved 10,000 paratroopers. The exchange rate was 10-1 in American favor. But more important than the numbers was the psychological impact. The German offensive had relied on speed and surprise. They needed to reach Antwerp before the Allies could respond. Patton's rapid counterattack shattered that timeline completely. Within a week, the Battle of the Bulge turned from German offensive to German disaster. Units that had advanced confidently into the Ardennes found themselves surrounded and destroyed. The losses were catastrophic. Over 100,000 German casualties, 800 tanks destroyed, 1,000 aircraft shot down. Hitler's last gamble had failed. And it had failed because one American general refused to accept that his army couldn't do the impossible. Eisenhower sent Patton a personal message on December 27th. George, the relief of Bastogne is the outstanding achievement of this campaign. You have demonstrated that the impossible is simply the untested. The Army, the nation, and I personally are in your debt. Patton's diary entry that night was characteristically brief. We did what they said couldn't be done. Again. I'm getting used to that. News of the relief spread across the Allied world. Newspapers ran headlines celebrating the victory. Radio broadcasts described the heroic defense of Bastogne and the miraculous relief. For the first time since the German offensive began, the mood shifted from fear to confidence. The German High Command drew their own conclusions. A captured intelligence assessment dated January 2, 1945 read, American Third Army under General Patton demonstrates operational flexibility unprecedented in modern warfare. Recommend all defensive planning account for response times 300 to 400% faster than standard doctrine suggests. In other words, they still couldn't predict what Patton would do. They could only try to prepare for the impossible. The Battle of the Bulge officially ended on January 25, 1945. The German army had been broken. Their last reserves were exhausted. The road to Berlin lay open, and George Patton was already planning his next impossible objective. From Metz to Bastogne, he had proven the same lesson twice. Expert predictions meant nothing to a commander who refused to believe them. Doctrine was a guide, not a cage. The impossible was simply the untested. But what happened to the man who kept achieving miracles? What was his fate after the war ended? And what lessons did his impossible victories leave for generations of military leaders who came after? The story of Patton and Metz has one final chapter. A chapter about legacy, about tragedy, and about the price of being the man who never believed in impossible. In Part 4, we'll discover what Eisenhower said about Patton years later, when he could finally speak freely. We'll learn how the tactics that shocked the world at Metz became the foundation of modern maneuver warfare. And we'll uncover the mysterious circumstances of Patton's death just months after his greatest victories. Because the man who conquered the unconquerable fortress had one more battle left to fight. And this time, the enemy wasn't German. British intelligence said Metz would take 180 days. Patton took it in 10. They projected 50,000 casualties. He delivered victory with under 3,000. When the Battle of the Bulge exploded across the Allied front, every expert said Third Army couldn't pivot 90 degrees in 48 hours. Patton did it in 36. He relieved Bastogne. He broke Hitler's last gamble. He achieved the impossible twice in 6 weeks. By January 1945, George Patton had become the most feared American commander in German intelligence assessments. His name appeared in captured documents more than any other Allied general. Hitler himself had ordered entire divisions repositioned specifically to stop Third Army. The man who never believed in impossible had proven his philosophy in blood and fire. But this story has a final chapter that most people never hear about. Because the same qualities that made Patton unstoppable in war would prove dangerous in peace. And the ending of his story carries a twist that raises questions still debated 80 years later. The spring of 1945 belonged to Patton. Third Army crossed the Rhine on March 22nd, beating Montgomery by 1 day, despite having fewer resources and less planning time. They liberated the Buchenwald concentration camp in April, exposing the full horror of Nazi atrocities. They captured over 1.5 million German prisoners. They advanced farther and faster than any army in history. When Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, Patton stood at the peak of his fame. He had commanded Third Army for 281 days of combat. His forces had liberated or gained 522 square miles of territory. They had captured 1,280 688 prisoners of war. They had killed, wounded, or captured an estimated 388 enemy soldiers. The casualty ratio was extraordinary. For every American lost, Third Army inflicted 10 casualties on the enemy. Eisenhower wrote in his official report, "Third Army's operations were the most sweeping and spectacular of the entire European campaign." General Patton's name will forever be associated with audacity, speed, and the relentless pursuit of victory. But peace did not suit George Patton. The war he had trained his entire life to fight was over. At 60 years old, he found himself commanding an occupation force instead of a combat army. He hated it. He was terrible at it. The same aggressive instincts that made him unstoppable against the Wehrmacht made him catastrophically unsuited for diplomacy and administration. Patton's troubles began almost immediately. He refused to remove former Nazi Party members from administrative positions in Bavaria, arguing that experienced administrators were needed to prevent chaos. The policy was pragmatic, but politically disastrous. Newspapers accused him of Nazi sympathies. Jewish groups protested. Washington demanded explanations. In September 1945, Patton gave a press conference that destroyed his career. When asked about denazification, he compared Nazi Party membership to political parties in America. The statement was taken out of context, but the damage was done. Headlines screamed that Patton was defending Nazis. Eisenhower had no choice. On October 2, 1945, he relieved Patton of command of 3rd Army and transferred him to the 15th Army, a paper organization with no troops, tasked only with writing the official history of the war. It was a humiliation disguised as a promotion. Patton knew it. Everyone knew it. His letters from this period reveal a man lost without purpose. He wrote to his wife, Beatrice, "I've been relieved. It was bound to come. I fought my last battle. What's left for an old cavalryman in a world that doesn't need cavalry anymore?" The man who had captured Metz in 10 days, who had relieved Bastogne against impossible odds, who had terrified the German high command with his audacity, was reduced to shuffling papers in a headquarters nobody cared about. On December 9, 1945, Patton's car was struck by a military truck near Mannheim, Germany. He was paralyzed from the neck down. 12 days later, on December 21, 1945, George Smith Patton, Jr. died of a pulmonary embolism. He was 60 years old. The circumstances of his death have spawned conspiracy theories for decades. The accident occurred at low speed. The other vehicle's driver was never formally investigated. Patton had made powerful enemies. Some historians suggest Soviet intelligence had motive to eliminate him. No conclusive evidence has ever emerged. What remains certain is the tragedy of his ending. The greatest combat commander of his generation died not in battle, but in a hospital bed, paralyzed and broken just 7 months after his greatest triumph. But Patton's legacy did not die with him. The tactics he pioneered at Metz became the foundation of modern maneuver warfare. His principle of simultaneous assault on multiple objectives, of using speed and aggression to create psychological collapse before physical defeat, transformed military doctrine worldwide. In 1976, the United States Army published FM 100-5 Operations, the first major doctrinal revision since World War II. The manual explicitly cited Patton's campaigns as examples of what came to be called air-land battle doctrine. The core principles were pure Patton: speed, aggression, simultaneous operations across the entire depth of enemy defenses, psychological disruption through operational tempo. During Operation Desert Storm in 1991, General Norman Schwarzkopf applied Patton's methods on a scale even Patton never imagined. The famous left hook that encircled Iraqi forces in Kuwait was straight from the 3rd Army playbook. 100 hours of ground combat, complete victory, casualty ratios that exceeded even Patton's remarkable record. Schwarzkopf later acknowledged his debt. "I studied Patton's campaigns extensively. His approach to Metz taught me that fortified positions aren't as strong as they appear if you hit them fast enough and hard enough from enough directions." The Israeli Defense Forces built their entire operational philosophy around Patton's principles. Their stunning victory in the Six-Day War of 1967 demonstrated what happened when speed and aggression met numerically superior enemies in fortified positions. The result was the same as Metz: total victory in days rather than months. Today, every major military academy in the Western world teaches Patton's campaigns. His methods have been studied, analyzed, and refined for 80 years. The fundamental insight remains unchanged. Expert predictions about what's possible are often wrong. Doctrine is a guide, not a prison. The impossible is simply the untested. But the lesson of Patton extends beyond military tactics. His story illuminates something fundamental about innovation and institutions. Why do organizations reject new ideas? Why do experts so often fail to predict what determined individuals can achieve? Why does conventional wisdom become a cage rather than a guide? The British intelligence assessment of Metz was not stupid. It was thorough, methodical, based on sound historical precedent and careful analysis. Their methodology was impeccable. Their conclusions were reasonable given their assumptions. The problem was their assumptions. They assumed any attacking commander would follow established doctrine. They assumed methodical, step-by-step siege warfare. They assumed rational actors making conservative decisions. They did not account for a commander who simply refused to believe the fortress was impregnable. This pattern repeats throughout history. Experts told the Wright brothers that heavier-than-air flight was impossible. Experts told Henry Ford that mass production would never work. Experts told Steve Jobs that consumers didn't want personal computers. The experts were always reasonable. Their analysis was always sound, and they were always wrong. Because expertise by its nature is backward-looking. Experts know what has been done. They understand what has worked. They can analyze why things failed. But they cannot predict what someone will achieve who doesn't know it's supposed to be impossible. Patton never read the British assessment of Metz, or if he did, he ignored it entirely. He didn't know he was supposed to fail, so he succeeded. This is the deepest lesson of his story. Not about tanks or artillery or siege warfare, about the limits of expert prediction, about the power of refusing to accept conventional wisdom, about the difference between analyzing what's been done and doing what hasn't. There's one final detail about Patton and Metz that almost nobody knows. In 1967, French military historians discovered a document in the archives of Fort Driant, the massive fortification that anchored the Metz defense. It was a letter written by the German garrison commander Colonel Hans von Luck, dated November 21, 1944, the day before his surrender. The letter was addressed to his wife. Parts of it have been translated and published. One passage stands out. The Americans attack in ways we cannot understand. Our doctrine says fortresses fall through systematic reduction, one strong point at a time, weeks or months of siege. But these Americans attack everywhere simultaneously. They do not pause to consolidate. They do not wait for artillery preparation. They simply keep coming from every direction. I asked my intelligence officer what doctrine they are following. He told me they are not following any doctrine we recognize. Their commander, General Patton, appears to invent his tactics as the battle develops. We have trained for years to defend against methodical assault. We do not know how to defend against madness. Tomorrow, I will surrender. Not because our walls have failed, not because our ammunition is exhausted, but because our minds have failed. We cannot cope with an enemy who does not follow any rules we understand. The fortress fell not because its concrete was weak. The fortress fell because its defenders' assumptions were wrong. 80 years later, that letter captures the essence of Patton's genius better than any analysis. He didn't defeat German fortifications. He defeated German assumptions. He didn't destroy their defenses. He destroyed their understanding of what was possible. From a general who ignored a 47-page intelligence assessment to a fortress that fell in 10 days instead of 180. From a relief operation that should have taken a week to a 48-hour pivot that saved 10,000 men. George Patton proved that expert consensus is not truth. That impossible is often just untested. That one person who refuses to believe the rules can achieve what armies following those rules cannot. The numbers tell the story. Third Army liberated 81,522 square miles. They captured 1,280,688 prisoners. They inflicted 1,811,388 enemy casualties at a 10-to-1 ratio in their favor. They achieved objectives 18 times faster than expert predictions, with 95% fewer casualties than projected. All because one man looked at the word impossible and simply didn't believe it. Patton once said wars may be fought with weapons, but they are won by men. It is the spirit of the men who follow and of the man who leads that gains the victory. He was wrong about one thing. It wasn't just spirit. It was the willingness to question what everyone else accepted, the courage to test what everyone else assumed, the audacity to attempt what everyone else declared impossible. That is the legacy of Metz. That is the lesson of Patton. That is why this story still matters 80 years later. If you know another story of impossible military innovation, share it in the comments below. World War II is full of moments when ordinary people refused to accept expert limitations and changed history as a result. Subscribe and hit the notification bell. We bring you the untold stories of military history, the ones that challenge what you thought you knew about what's possible. Because somewhere right now, someone is being told their idea is impossible. Someone is being shown the analysis proving it can't work. Someone is facing a 47-page report explaining why they should give up. And somewhere, one of them will refuse to believe it. That person will become the next Patton, the next impossible success story. The next proof that expert consensus is not destiny. History doesn't remember the people who believed the reports. History remembers the people who ignored them and won anyway.